Hey y'all, I'm David, and this game is called Kerbal Space Program. This is a recent mission I did in the game where I used what is called an SSTO, a type of craft that can take a payload from the surface of a planet all the way to space without using any state separations. I was using that type of craft to bring a new crew module to my space station. You'll see right now that I'm just taking off and I'm now flying somewhat level to increase my speed. In fact, I just broke the sound barrier, and we're also gaining some altitude, but not a whole lot for this first part. Alright, now we're starting to get some more altitude. In fact, we're also getting a lot of speed too. You'll see the plasma on the side of the craft there. The craft is hitting the atmosphere so fast that it's heating the gases in the atmosphere to a plasma, which is where you get that glowing. Alright, so we just switched the Rapier engines from their air breathing to closed cycle modes so that they can give us a bit more oomph before we get into space. And we're now out of oxidizer, so we're switching from the Rapiers to the nuclear engines. And those will get us the rest of the way into space. So in this game, the planet Kerbal, which is where we took off from, has an atmosphere that ends around 70,000 meters. So until then, I'm going to wait to extend the solar panels. But now that we're out of that range, we can extend that stuff, and we can start plotting the circularization burn. Alright, that burn is now planned, so we can orient the craft and then time warp. There will be a lot of time warping in this video. In fact, this video is only going to be 10 minutes long, but for the astronauts we're bringing with us, it will be, in fact, multiple days. This footage is also sped up, so again, for you it's 10 minutes, but for me piloting the craft, it was actually around 40. Alright, so now that first burn is done, but I've intentionally left the lowest point still just barely above the atmosphere, lower than the lowest point of the space station's orbit. That way, on the whole, our orbit takes less time than the station's. Because of this, we will slowly catch up to the station before we finally do our docking procedures. So now I'm doing some more time warping so that we can get a really close encounter with the station. And then eventually we will have, I think in the end, the closest encounter we got was around 500 meters before I started using RCS and other things to get even closer. And right there inside that cargo bay, you just saw it, was my payload. It's just some crew compartments for the station to expand the number of astronauts that can live there. So now we are, actually, that green marker right there that you just saw, that is where the station is relative to the craft. It's also going to show you the distance between us and the station. So right now it's about 18.3 kilometers. So now I am reducing the velocity relative to the target, the space station, and setting up a closer encounter. And now you can just barely see the station. And there we are, just a few hundred meters away. Now, while we're near the station, you should be watching it very carefully because while I'm nearby, the station will actually nearly shake itself apart. This is because of the very overactive reaction wheels on the station that I, later on, will actually turn down to prevent more damage. But you'll see that there are two fuel tanks near the left side of the station, and that one on the far left, the far back of the station, will eventually shake itself off of the station while I'm piloting closer to it. It's not a huge deal. After all, we still have lots of fuel supply on the station, and most of my missions don't even need to go to the station to refuel. So it's not a big deal. So now I'm using RCS to try and get a bit closer to the station. But it ends up not going so well because the RCS on this craft is a bit lacking. There's only 8 RCS blocks in the front of the craft and none in the back, so I don't have a whole lot of control. You might have just missed it just now, so I suggest you rewind, but that second fuel tank just popped off. Alright, so now I'm using the nuclear engines again to, and also the RCS engines, to get really close to that docking port. And for a few more seconds, minutes in real time, I'll be trying fruitlessly to get this craft to dock to that station. It's not going to happen, but you'll see that I'm using those RCS blocks in the front to try and get closer to it. But yeah, it doesn't end up working out. So after a few more seconds, there we go, right now, I give up trying to dock the SSTO with the station, and I'll just get the payload out and dock that, because that's the actual point of this mission, isn't it? So now that I've undocked the payload from the SSTO, we're going to move it closer to the station, and in a moment you'll see it dock. There we are. So now I can extend those solar panels again, and we will inspect the damage. You'll see that the back docking port of the station was snapped off with that fuel tank, so I won't be able to attach anything else on the back there in the future. So in future missions, I'll have to find some other way to dock things. There are still, if I remember correctly, there should be 7 more docking ports. They're just a different size on the station. Alright, so I've just plotted my maneuver to get back to Kerbal. All we have to do really is just slow down our velocity, and then because we'll be moving slower, my lowest point in the orbit will actually end up being within the atmosphere, and then the atmosphere can slow me down before I finally land. Alright, so now we are under that 70,000 meter mark, so we are going to start slowing down. I also want to reorient the craft so that we minimize the effects of heating on the craft so we don't end up damaging anything. There are a few parts in the craft that are very sensitive to heat, such as those 2 solar panels on the other side. Also, the air brakes and the parachutes don't really like heating so much. About now, I realized that I actually had overshot the Space Center and that I'd need to find some way to slow down sooner so that I could actually land where I wanted to. Unfortunately, by now it's actually too late and I won't be able to slow down before we pass the center. There you can see it on just to the right of the craft on the ground. There's a runway. That's where I wanted to land, and we've passed it. Not a huge deal. I can just flip over, try to turn around, try to get down there, and slow down and land. However, I think I was a bit too aggressive there because I almost ended up going in the water. Now, this craft can safely do a water landing, but ideally, we'd prefer to land on a runway. In the worst situations, I can open those parachutes that are on the front of the craft, which I normally would use for landings, vertical landings on planets like Duna, which is an analog for Mars. Parachutes aren't really effective on Duna, I guess, which is why I would use them in conjunction with the rapiers in their closed cycle mode. Alright, so here's our landing, and we touch down on the runway and activate the brakes. However, it ends up not being enough to slow down before I go off the edge of the runway. so we will stop in the grass. But that concludes the mission. I hope you had a good time watching it. I plan on perhaps showing a few more videos like this one on the channel, so keep an eye out for those. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.